My grandmother locked me in the attic every full moon for 12 years, but last night I discovered why. She says I was born wrong, and the moonlight reveals what I really am. The moonlight hit my face and nothing happened. I stood there in the backyard at 2:13 in the morning, barefoot in wet grass, waiting for the transformation grandmother had warned me about my entire life. The monster that lived inside me, the thing that moonlight supposedly awakened, the reason I'd spent every full moon locked in our attic since I was 5 years old. I waited for my skin to change, for my eyes to shift, for the beast to emerge. But there was only silence and silver light and the steady rhythm of my own completely normal heartbeat. I was 17 years old, standing under my first full moon, and I felt nothing except the cold seeping through my nightgown and a rage building in my chest that I couldn't name. Grandmother's bedroom light clicked on in the window above me. I heard her scream my name, that sharp, terrified shriek I'd heard through attic floorboards 100 times before. She thought I was transforming. She thought I was becoming the thing she'd always feared. But I was just a girl standing in moonlight, realizing that everything I'd ever been told about myself was a lie. I should explain how I got here, standing in my grandmother's garden at 2 o'clock in the morning during the September harvest moon. My name is Iris Thornwood, and I've lived with my grandmother Constance in her Victorian house on Maple Ridge since I was 3 days old. My mother died giving birth to me, hemorrhaging on the delivery table while I took my first breaths in the room next door. My father, according to grandmother, was a drifter who disappeared the moment he learned about the pregnancy. So it was always just me and Constance in that big creaking house with its wraparound porch and its attic that smelled like cedar and secrets. She raised me with strict rules and stricter love, the kind that came with conditions and curfews and a locked door every 29 days when the moon swelled full. I was 5 the first time she put me in the attic. I remember crying, beating my small fists against the heavy oak door while she whispered through the keyhole that it was for my own good. That something in my blood made me dangerous when the moon was bright. That my mother had been the same way, and look what happened to her. The attic became my monthly prison. Grandmother had converted it into something almost comfortable. A small bed with worn quilts, a bookshelf stocked with approved reading material, a portable toilet in the corner, and thick curtains nailed over the single window so not a sliver of moonlight could reach me. She would lock me in at sunset on full moon nights and release me at dawn, always checking my face first, always exhaling with relief when she saw I was still myself. The rules were absolute and non-negotiable. No moonlight ever, not even reflected light, not even through clouds. If I was caught outside after dark during the full moon phase, the consequences would be catastrophic. I would transform, she said, into something hungry and wrong, something that would hurt the people I loved, something that couldn't be controlled or reasoned with. I believed her because she was my grandmother, because she fed me and clothed me and read me stories before bed, because I had no one else to believe. School was a challenge she navigated carefully. I was homeschooled until age 12, when grandmother decided I needed socialization to appear normal. She enrolled me at Ridgewood Academy, a private school small enough that she could control the narrative. She met with Principal Diana Castellano personally, explaining my rare medical condition in hushed, concerned tones. A photosensitivity disorder, she called it, that caused severe psychotic episodes when exposed to certain wavelengths of natural moonlight. The school accommodated accordingly. I was excused from any evening events, field trips were carefully vetted, and my teachers were instructed to never question my monthly absences. I made friends cautiously, always declining sleepovers and parties and anything that might keep me out past sunset during the dangerous days. When classmates asked why, I repeated the story grandmother had taught me. Rare medical condition, severe reactions, nothing interesting, changed the subject. Most accepted it because teenagers have their own problems to worry about. My best friend Margot Sinclair was the only one who pushed back. We met in 9th grade biology class, assigned as lab partners, and something clicked between us immediately. Margot had wild curly hair she refused to tame, and a laugh that filled rooms and a stubborn curiosity that wouldn't let anything go. She noticed my patterns before anyone else did. Noticed how I tracked the lunar calendar with anxious precision. Noticed how I flinched when someone mentioned camping under the stars. Noticed how I always made excuses when the moon grew round and bright. She asked me directly one afternoon in the library, her voice low and serious. "What's really going on with you, Iris?" And I wanted so badly to tell her, to share the weight of my secret with someone who might understand. But grandmother's warnings echoed in my head. No one could know the truth about what I was. If they knew, they would fear me. They would hunt me. They would never look at me the same way again. I was 16 when the first crack appeared in grandmother's story. I'd been reading about genetic disorders for a school project, researching conditions that affected sensitivity to light. Xeroderma pigmentosum caught my attention, a real disease where sunlight damaged DNA and caused severe skin reactions. But moonlight, I learned, was just reflected sunlight, the same wavelengths bounced off lunar surface. If I was truly photosensitive to moonlight, I should react to sunlight too. I should have burns and lesions and the documentation of a genuine medical condition. Instead, I spent summers in the garden with grandmother, skin tanning normally, body functioning perfectly in broad daylight. I mentioned this discrepancy at dinner one evening, trying to sound casual. Grandmother's fork paused midway to her mouth. Her eyes, usually soft with grandmotherly affection, went sharp and cold for just a fraction of a second. Your condition is different, she said carefully. It only responds to natural moonlight. Something about the specific frequency reflected at night. Very rare, very poorly understood. Don't question what you don't comprehend. But I had started questioning, and once you start, you can't stop. I began noticing other inconsistencies in the stories grandmother told about my mother. Sometimes she said my mother's symptoms started at puberty. Other times she said they were present from birth. Sometimes she described my mother as gentle and artistic. Other times as volatile and dangerous. The details shifted like sand, never quite settling into a coherent picture. I found no photographs of my mother anywhere in the house, no letters, no diaries, nothing that proved this woman had ever existed beyond grandmother's word. When I asked to see my mother's grave, grandmother said she'd been cremated, ashes scattered somewhere she couldn't remember. When I asked about medical records documenting her condition, grandmother said they'd been lost in a hospital fire years ago. Every trail led to a dead end, every question answered with convenient tragedy. I started keeping a journal of discrepancies, hiding it beneath a loose floorboard in my room like the secret it was. The attic became harder to endure once doubt had taken root. I would lie on that narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, counting the hours until dawn while my mind raced with questions I couldn't answer. What if grandmother was wrong about me? What if the condition she described didn't exist at all? What if 12 years of isolation had been for nothing? The thought was too terrifying to fully embrace, so I pushed it down, buried it beneath the familiar routine of compliance. But something had shifted fundamentally inside me. I no longer locked myself in the attic because I believed I was dangerous. I locked myself in because I feared what would happen if I didn't. Grandmother's disappointment was a force of nature, crushing and inescapable. Her anger was worse, cold and silent and capable of lasting weeks. I had spent my entire life trying to please her, trying to be the good granddaughter she deserved despite my cursed blood. The possibility that I'd been deceived didn't just challenge my understanding of myself. It challenged everything I thought I knew about love. The September I turned 17, everything accelerated toward collapse. School had started 3 weeks earlier, and I was taking AP Psychology with a new teacher named Dr. Warren Fuller, a clinical psychologist who'd left private practice to educate young minds. He was in his late 50s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and a habit of asking questions that made students actually think. Our first major unit was on abnormal psychology, the clinical classification of mental disorders and the history of treatment. He lectured about conditions once believed to be demonic possession or moral failing, about patients locked in asylums for exhibiting symptoms we now understood as treatable illness, about the damage done by families who believed the worst about their loved ones instead of seeking proper help. I sat in the back of his classroom, taking notes with trembling hands, feeling like he was speaking directly to some buried part of me. After class one day, I lingered until the other students had filed out. Dr. Fuller looked up from his desk with that patient, observant expression that made him such an effective therapist. "Something on your mind, Iris?" I hadn't planned what to say, but the words came tumbling out anyway. Hypothetically speaking, I started, then paused, gathering courage. If someone had been told their whole life that they had a dangerous condition, but they'd never actually experienced symptoms, never had medical documentation, never seen a doctor confirm the diagnosis, what would that mean? Dr. Fuller was quiet for a long moment, studying my face with professional concern. "That would mean," he said slowly, "that someone should probably investigate whether the condition actually exists, or whether something else entirely is going on." He handed me his business card, the one from his private practice that he no longer ran but still kept for emergencies. "If that hypothetical person ever wants to talk to someone confidential," he added, "my door is always open." I started skipping my Wednesday study period to meet with Dr. Fuller in his office, unofficial sessions that he documented carefully in case I ever needed records of our conversations. He helped me research photosensitivity disorders, lunar cycle reactions, anything that might explain what grandmother claimed I had. We found nothing matching her description. Every legitimate medical condition involving light sensitivity had been studied, documented, peer-reviewed, and none of them worked the way she said mine did. He introduced me to the concept of Munchausen syndrome by proxy, a pattern where caregivers fabricate or induce illness in those under their care for psychological reasons. The description made my stomach drop and my hands go cold. But that would mean grandmother had deliberately lied to me for years, had imprisoned me monthly for over a decade, had built my entire identity around a falsehood she invented and maintained. I couldn't accept that. Not yet. Not without proof that would force me to accept it. The proof came, as proof often does, through a small and unexpected crack. Grandmother had a dentist appointment on the afternoon of September 23rd, the day before the full moon. She usually scheduled her appointments around my lockup schedule, never leaving me alone during the dangerous days, but something had gone wrong with her calendar this time. She fussed and worried before leaving, making me promise to stay inside, to avoid all windows once the sun started setting, to lock myself in the attic early if she wasn't back in time. She left at 3:30, expecting to return by 5. The dentist's office called at 4:15 to say she'd had a minor adverse reaction to the anesthesia and would need to stay for observation. She wouldn't be home until after dark. I hung up the phone and stood in the kitchen, heart pounding, realizing I was alone for the first time in my life during a full moon night. I went to the attic. I truly did intend to lock myself in, to be the good granddaughter, to follow the rules that had governed my entire existence. I climbed those creaking stairs, opened that heavy oak door, looked at the narrow bed and the covered window and the portable toilet in the corner. 12 years of my life had been spent in this room, one night at a time, accumulating into months of stolen existence. I had missed birthday parties, school dances, summer bonfires, meteor showers, midnight movie marathons, and every other experience that required being awake and outdoors after dark during the wrong phase of the moon. I had missed living because grandmother told me I was too dangerous to live freely. I stood in that doorway and something inside me finally broke. Not dramatic, not explosive. Just a quiet snapping, like a thread pulled too tight for too long. I closed the attic door from the outside, walked down the stairs, and stepped out into the September evening. The moon hadn't risen yet when I first went outside, but I waited. I sat on the back porch steps and watched the eastern horizon, trembling with terror and anticipation in equal measure. Part of me still believed I would transform, that grandmother's warnings would prove true, that I would become something monstrous and wake to find blood on my hands. But a larger part, the part that had been growing stronger since I started questioning, needed to know the truth more than I needed to feel safe. The moon crested the tree line at 7:42 that evening, enormous and golden and beautiful. I watched it rise and felt nothing but awe at its beauty. I stepped off the porch into its light and felt nothing but cool grass beneath my bare feet. I stood there for hours, moving through shadows and silver illumination, testing every angle and every intensity of moonlight my skin could absorb. Nothing happened. No transformation, no violence, no loss of control. Just a teenage girl standing in her grandmother's garden, crying with relief and rage. That's when grandmother came home. I heard her car pull into the driveway, heard her scream my name when she saw the back door standing open, heard her footsteps racing through the house. She burst onto the porch and found me standing in full moonlight, untransformed, entirely human, looking back at her with eyes that saw her clearly for the first time. Her face cycled through emotions I'd never witnessed before. Terror, relief, confusion, then something calculated and cold that made my blood run thick. "Oh, Iris," she breathed, her voice trembling with forced concern. "Thank God I got here in time. You must have gotten lucky tonight. The clouds must have blocked the worst of it, but we need to get you inside right now before the transformation starts." I didn't move. I just looked at her, this woman who had raised me, who I had trusted completely, who had stolen 12 years of my life with a lie I was only beginning to understand. "There are no clouds," I said quietly. "There's nothing wrong with me. There never was there?" Grandmother's mask slipped completely in that moment, and I saw someone I didn't recognize staring out from behind my grandmother's familiar face. She recovered quickly, pulling the concerned grandmother persona back into place, but I had seen the truth in that split second of exposure. She was afraid, yes, but not afraid for me. Afraid of me. Afraid of what I might do now that I knew. She reached for my arm, trying to guide me toward the house, her grip tighter than necessary. "We need to talk about this inside," she said, voice straining for calm. "There's so much you don't understand about your condition, about what I've been protecting you from." I yanked my arm away with more force than I'd ever used against her. "What condition?" I demanded, voice rising. "I've been standing in moonlight for 3 hours and nothing has happened. Nothing is going to happen. So what exactly have you been protecting me from?" Grandmother's face hardened into an expression I'd never seen before. "From yourself," she said coldly. "From the truth about what you really are." She turned and walked into the house, clearly expecting me to follow. I did, but I grabbed my phone from the kitchen counter first, making sure the voice recorder was activated in my pocket. Whatever she was about to say, I wanted documentation. She led me to her study, a room I was rarely allowed to enter, and sat behind her antique desk like a judge preparing to deliver a verdict. I sat across from her in the hard wooden chair she kept for difficult conversations, realizing I'd never sat in it before, realizing I'd never been considered difficult enough to warrant this kind of confrontation. She stared at me for a long moment, then opened a desk drawer and pulled out a manila folder stuffed with papers. She slid it across to me and I recognized my own name on the tab. "This is everything," she said. "All the records I've kept about you since the day you were born. Read it, and then we'll talk about what comes next." The folder contained documents I'd never seen before, medical records from a hospital I didn't recognize, letters between grandmother and various doctors and lawyers, photographs of a woman who looked startlingly like me but wasn't my mother. The woman in the photos was younger than I'd expected, mid-20s at most, with my exact shade of auburn hair and my exact pattern of freckles across her nose. She was also visibly pregnant in several images, one hand resting on her swollen belly, eyes distant and troubled. I looked at grandmother, waiting for explanation, but she just gestured for me to keep reading. The medical records detailed a pregnancy complicated by what doctors called severe psychiatric disturbance. The letters discussed custody arrangements, financial agreements, provisions for a child who hadn't yet been born. And buried near the bottom of the stack, I found a birth certificate that made no sense at all. Mother's name, Constance Eleanor Thornwood. My grandmother's name, father's name, unknown, child's name, Iris Thornwood. My name, my birth certificate, listing my grandmother as my mother. I looked up at Constance, my grandmother, my mother, the woman who had lied to me for 17 years in ways I was only beginning to comprehend. She met my gaze with something approaching defiance, chin raised, hands folded on her desk like she was conducting a business meeting, rather than shattering my entire understanding of my own existence. She explained in clipped, unemotional sentences. She had become pregnant at 43, a scandal that would have destroyed her reputation in her conservative social circle. The father was a man she'd been seeing in secret, a married man from her church, a man who would never acknowledge what they'd done. She considered abortion, but couldn't go through with it. She considered adoption, but couldn't bear the thought of her child being raised by strangers. So she invented a daughter who had died in childbirth, complete with fake funeral and cremated remains, and claimed the baby that arrived 7 months later as her orphaned granddaughter. The perfect solution, she said, like she was describing a particularly clever business arrangement. No one suspected a thing. But the lies required more lies to sustain them. If I was her granddaughter, there had to have been a daughter first. If there was a daughter, there had to be a history, a personality, a reason she wasn't there to raise her own child. Constance invented everything. My fictional mother's artistic temperament, her instability, her dangerous reactions to moonlight that supposedly killed her during childbirth. The moonlight story served multiple purposes, she explained. It explained why I couldn't go out at night during certain times, which limited my social connections and reduced the risk of me discovering the truth. It gave her absolute control over my schedule, my activities, my entire existence. And it planted the seed that something was fundamentally wrong with me, something I had inherited from my dangerous fictional mother, something that made me dependent on Constance's protection. The attic lockups weren't about protecting the world from me. They were about isolating me from the world, preventing me from forming attachments that might lead to questions, ensuring I remained grateful and obedient and too afraid of myself to ever challenge her authority. I sat in that hard wooden chair, holding the documents that proved my entire life was a fabrication, feeling like the floor had dropped away beneath me. Constance watched me with clinical detachment, waiting for my reaction like I was an experiment she'd been conducting for 17 years. Which, in a sense, I was. I asked the question that burned hottest in my chest, voice barely above a whisper. Did you ever love me at all? Or was I just a problem you were managing? Her expression flickered with something that might have been genuine emotion, quickly suppressed. I kept you fed and clothed and educated, she said stiffly. I gave you a home when I could have given you away. That's more than many people in my position would have done. I noticed she hadn't answered my actual question. I noticed she probably never would. I stood up from the chair, legs unsteady, folder clutched against my chest. I'm leaving, I said. I'm going to Margot's house, and in the morning I'm going to Dr. Fuller, and we're going to figure out what happens next. Constance's face went white. You can't, she said sharply. You can't tell anyone about this. She stood too, moving between me and the study door, her composure cracking into something desperate and ugly. Think about what you're doing, she hissed. Think about what people will say. About me, about you, about this family's reputation. I built everything, sacrificed everything, to give us a respectable life, and you want to throw it all away because of some misplaced teenage rebellion? I stared at her, this stranger wearing my grandmother's face, and felt something cold settle into my bones. She wasn't sorry for what she'd done to me. She was worried about how it would look. 12 years of monthly imprisonment, 17 years of identity theft and psychological manipulation, and her primary concern was her reputation in the community garden club. You locked me in an attic for 12 years, I said slowly, watching my words land like physical blows. You made me believe I was a monster. You stole my childhood, my friendships, my entire sense of self. And you think I should keep quiet to protect your reputation? She flinched, but didn't back down. Everything I did was to protect you from the truth, she insisted. You think it would have been better growing up knowing you were a bastard child born to a woman old enough to be your grandmother? Knowing your father was a married man who wanted nothing to do with you? I was protecting you from a cruel world. I pushed past her, shoulder connecting with her shoulder, refusing to let her body block my exit any longer. She grabbed my arm as I reached the door, fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. If you leave, she warned, voice low and venomous. If you tell anyone what happened here, I will deny everything. Who do you think people will believe? A confused teenage girl with documented mental health issues, or a respected community leader with 40 years of good standing? I'll tell them you had a psychotic break, that you invented these accusations to hurt me, that your condition finally manifested just like I always feared it would. They'll lock you up somewhere far worse than the attic, Iris. They'll throw away the key. I yanked my arm free and turned to face her one last time, pulling my phone from my pocket and stopping the recording that had been running since the beginning of our conversation. Let them try, I said quietly. I have every word you just said documented, every admission, every threat, every lie exposed. And unlike you, I'm not afraid of the truth anymore. I ran. Out of her study, through the front door, down the porch steps into the September night. The moon hung full and bright overhead, casting silver light across my path as I sprinted toward Margot's house 6 blocks away. My lungs burned and my legs ached and tears streamed down my face, but I didn't stop until I was standing on her front porch, pounding on her door at nearly 11 at night. Her father answered, immediately concerned by my disheveled appearance and obvious distress. Margot appeared behind him moments later, took one look at my face, and pulled me inside without a single question. She guided me to her room, closed the door, and sat beside me on her bed while I fell apart completely. The whole story came pouring out between sobs, years of secrets finally breaking free. The attic, the moonlight lie, the birth certificate, the recording on my phone. Margot held my hand through all of it, her expression cycling through shock and rage and fierce protective fury. When I finally ran out of words, she pulled me into a hug so tight I could barely breathe and made me a promise I would hold her to for years. We're going to destroy her, Iris. Every lie, every prison night, every stolen year. She's going to pay for all of it. Margot's parents were lawyers, both of them, which I'd always known but never appreciated until that night. Her mother, Dr. Elaine Sinclair, specialized in family law with a particular focus on custody disputes and child protection cases. Her father, Thomas Sinclair, handled criminal defense but had connections throughout the legal system. They listened to my story in their kitchen at midnight, faces growing grimmer with each new detail. When I played the recording from Constance's study, Dr. Sinclair's jaw tightened with controlled outrage. "This is false imprisonment of a minor," she said quietly. "Child abuse through psychological manipulation and physical confinement, fraud related to the falsified identity documents, and those are just the charges I can identify immediately." She looked at her husband across the table. "Tom, we need to contact CPS first thing in the morning, and probably the police, depending on what they find when they investigate." I stayed in Margot's guest room that night, the first time I'd ever slept somewhere other than my grandmother's house. The first time I'd ever been outside during a full moon without consequence. The first time I'd ever felt like I might actually be free. The investigation that followed moved faster than anyone expected. Detective Ramona Cortez, 14 years with the county sheriff's department and the lead investigator assigned to my case, later told me she'd never seen such clean documentation of long-term child abuse. The recording from Constance's study was damning on its own, but combined with the falsified birth certificate, the medical records showing I'd never been diagnosed with any photosensitivity condition, and the testimony of Dr. Fuller about my psychological state, the case against my grandmother was virtually airtight. CPS conducted an emergency investigation of her home, discovering the attic room still set up for containment, complete with the locked door, the blacked-out window, and a calendar on the wall with every full moon night for the past decade marked in red. They also found a journal Constance had kept, documenting my behavior during each lockup, noting with apparent satisfaction how compliant and grateful I remained despite my imprisonment. She had genuinely believed she was doing the right thing, the journal revealed. Not protecting me, but protecting herself from the shame of her situation. The arrest happened 5 days after I fled her house. Constance Eleanor Thornwood, age 60, prominent member of the Maple Ridge Community Association, devoted churchgoer, and apparently loving grandmother, was taken into custody on charges of felony child abuse, false imprisonment, identity fraud, and obstruction of government operations related to the falsified death certificate of my fictional mother. The local news covered the arrest extensively, fascinated by the gothic horror of the case, the attic prison, the full moon rituals, the elaborate web of lies maintained for nearly 2 decades. I watched the footage from Margot's living room, seeing Constance's face for what I hoped would be the last time, her expression cycling through indignation and disbelief as officers guided her into a patrol car. She maintained her innocence throughout, claiming I had fabricated the evidence, that the recording had been edited, that she was the victim of a troubled teenager's delusions. No one believed her. The evidence was too comprehensive, the documentation too thorough, the pattern of abuse too clearly established. The trial took place 8 months later, after extensive pre-trial proceedings and failed plea negotiations. District Attorney Marcus Webb, a 20-year veteran prosecutor with a reputation for aggressive child advocacy, handled the case personally. He presented evidence methodically: the falsified documents, the recording, testimony from Dr. Fuller about my psychological manipulation, reports from CPS investigators about the attic room's configuration. He called me to the stand on the 3rd day, and I answered his questions with steady clarity, describing 12 years of imprisonment in measured, factual terms. When he asked me how I felt during those nights locked in the attic, I told him the truth. I felt like I was protecting people from myself. I felt grateful that someone cared enough to keep me contained. I felt like the monster she told me I was. And then I felt nothing at all, because it was easier than feeling anything real. The jury was out for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. Constance was sentenced to 15 years in state prison, with no possibility of parole for the first 10. The aftermath was both simpler and more complicated than I'd expected. The Sinclair family formally fostered me for my final year of high school, and I moved into their guest room permanently. Dr. Fuller connected me with a colleague, Dr. Priya Vasquez, a trauma specialist who helped me begin processing 17 years of identity confusion and psychological abuse. We worked together twice weekly, unpacking the layers of lies that had shaped my understanding of myself. She helped me understand that my compliance wasn't weakness, that survival under those conditions required adaptation, that the monster I'd believed myself to be was a fiction designed to keep me controllable. I graduated from Ridgewood Academy with honors, Margot beside me at the ceremony, both of us crying when they called my name. My real name, officially corrected through court order. Iris Thornwood, daughter of Constance Thornwood, and an unknown father whose identity I eventually learned but chose not to pursue. Some truths I discovered aren't worth the pain of uncovering. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. I started college the following fall, studying psychology because Dr. Fuller and Dr. Vasquez had shown me what healing could look like, and I wanted to offer that to others who had survived impossible situations. Margot attended the same university, different major, but we shared an apartment off campus for all 4 years. She never let me minimize what had happened to me, never let me slip into the old patterns of excusing Constance's behavior as misguided love. She reminded me again and again that love doesn't lock children in attics. Love doesn't build cages out of lies. Love doesn't steal someone's identity to protect your own reputation. What Constance did to me wasn't love, not even a twisted version of it. It was control, pure and simple. It was a woman so terrified of consequences that she imprisoned her own child rather than face the truth of what she'd done. The Moonlight story was never about protecting me from some fictional curse. It was about protecting her from me, from the questions I might ask, from the truths I might uncover, from the freedom that would allow me to become someone she couldn't control. I'm 23 now, 6 years removed from that September night when I first stood under a full moon and discovered I was human after all. I work at a nonprofit organization that supports survivors of family abuse, helping them navigate the legal and psychological aftermath of experiences no child should endure. Some nights when the moon is full and bright, I go outside specifically to stand in its light. Not because I need to prove anything anymore, but because it still feels like victory. Every moonlit moment is a reclamation, a reminder that I am not what she told me I was. I am not cursed or dangerous or born wrong. I am simply a person who survived someone else's fear and shame, someone who built a life from the wreckage of lies. Constance is still in prison, will be for another 4 years at minimum. I don't visit her. I don't write. I don't think about her more than necessary. She took 12 years of my nights, and I refuse to give her a single minute more. Margot asked me once, during our senior year of college, if I hated Constance for what she did. The question caught me off guard because I'd never really examined my feelings that closely. Hate seemed too simple, too clean for the tangle of emotions I carried. What I felt was more like grief. Grief for the childhood I never had. Grief for the mother I thought I'd lost but who never existed. Grief for the relationship with my real mother that could have been but was poisoned from my first breath by her shame and fear. I grieved for 17 years of believing I was a monster, for 12 years of attic nights, for every friendship I kept shallow because I was afraid of what would happen if someone got too close. I grieved for the girl I might have been if I'd grown up knowing the truth, even an ugly truth, instead of living inside an elaborate lie. Hate was in there somewhere, buried under all that grief, but it wasn't the dominant note anymore. Dr. Vasquez helped me understand that healing doesn't require forgiveness or hatred. Sometimes it just requires acceptance that you survived something terrible and permission to build something better from the ruins. The full moon is tomorrow night. I'll be at the nonprofit office late, running our monthly support group for adult survivors of childhood confinement and isolation. We meet on full moons specifically, a small reclamation for those of us who were taught to fear the light. After the meeting, I'll walk home through the park, letting the moonlight wash over me, feeling nothing but peace and distant sadness for the girl I used to be. That girl believed she was cursed, believed she was dangerous, believed she deserved every locked door and blackened window and stolen night. She believed because she had no choice, because the person who should have protected her instead convinced her she was something to be protected from. But that girl doesn't exist anymore. She transformed eventually, but not into the monster her grandmother feared. She transformed into someone who survived, someone who told the truth, someone who refused to let lies define her existence. The moonlight didn't reveal what she really was. The truth did. And the truth was so much simpler and so much more painful than any curse could ever be. She was just a child, born to a woman who couldn't face the consequences of her choices, raised on fear and isolation, and the desperate hope that compliance would earn her love. That child deserved better. They all do. If you made it this far, hit like. You've earned it.